Thank you, Bobby, and thank you everyone for having me here today. Afternoon, everyone. My name is Magali Wardle. I'm currently the Acting Director of NABERS in Australia, and I'd just like to say this has been a great day. There's such a great vibe in the room, and I particularly appreciated the welcome at the very beginning of the day, and I personally felt really welcome as a result of that, and I feel like that vibe has continued through the rest of the day. So it's really great to be here in Auckland and take part in the Green Property Summit. There's four main things I'd like to cover today. First of all, a bit of an intro to NABERS for those of you that maybe aren't so familiar with how that works. Then I want to talk a little bit about how policy plays in with NABERS and how that's driven some really great outcomes in Australia, and we're starting to see that in New Zealand as well. I'd like to touch a little bit on NABERS sector expansion and what that looks like in Australia. And finally, building on the points that Bobby was just making, just the important part that sustainable finance is going to play in this net zero transition. So NABERS is the National Australian Built Environment Rating System, quite a mouthful, which is why we call it NABERS. We're a national organisation administered by the New South Wales Government. NABERS ratings have been helping business owners measure and manage their performance for 25 years. I think the really important part about NABERS ratings is that they provide a rating based on actual performance. So we look at actual energy bills and actual water bills, and we give away, and that rating is done by a third-party verified assessor as well. The real benefit of having that professional assessor come to your site to do your rating is that they are often sustainability professionals in their own right, and they can give some really good advice straight up about how buildings can improve on their performance. So how does the rating work? You get a rating from 1 to 6 stars based on your operational performance, where 3 stars is what we call average, 6 stars is market leading, and I guess anything less than 3 stars, we like to say there's some good room for improvement, and often some really low-hanging fruit for energy efficiency improvements. One of the really nice things about NABERS ratings is that they allow building owners to compare their performance with other similar buildings. So we account for things like the size of the building and the hours that are worked in the building and climate zones and things like that. And they also track progress over time. Star ratings also provide a really common language for sustainability. So as an example, if you say, to your Treasury department, this building has a rating that's 6 stars out of 6. That's a really easy message to understand. Whereas if you say this building has 50 kilograms of carbon per metre squared, that doesn't really mean anything to anyone. So NABERS ratings really help with those conversations as well. I think we've been hearing quite a lot today about the importance of measurement and management, and that as you measure things, then you can start to manage them. And the same goes for building performance. So over the history of NABERS, we've tracked office buildings that have been regularly rating with NABERS, and this has been actually over the last 25 years. And we found that the average building can expect to improve their energy consumption by around 33% over 10 years. And that's basically world leading. And that's the average building. Some of them are a lot better than that. And the other benefit is that this kind of energy efficiency also really delivers tangible emissions savings, as well as making space on the grid for other users and saving money for businesses on their utility bills. So moving to how NABERS New Zealand and NABERS Australia work together. So NABERS New Zealand is actually licensed to the New Zealand government through the Energy Efficiency Conservation Authority, another mouthful, so that's why we call it EECA. And it's administered by our friends at the New Zealand Green Building Council. NABERS New Zealand currently offers energy ratings for offices, and soon there'll be water as well, right, Bobby? And the rating algorithm has been adjusted to suit New Zealand conditions, things like energy sources, emissions, and the climate zones here in New Zealand. Following the scheme's launch in 2012, the programme has grown steadily. So it was great to see those numbers that you just flashed up earlier there, Bobby. And, we had a 16% growth last year, which is amazing to see. New Zealand has also recently introduced ratings for public hospitals, and the first of those are due to be submitted later this year. So I want to talk a little bit now about how policy and building energy efficiency and sustainability play together in Australia. And so it's kind of like a history lesson, really. So as I've said, NABERS ratings have been in place for 25 years in Australia. And the ratings for office buildings were first released in 1999. Now we currently rate 70% of the office market every year. So you can see the participation has been driven by a combination of government policies at both state and government level. And what that's done is created transparency in the market. And that in itself has driven demand for more energy efficient buildings and a whole ecosystem of initiatives that are based on NABERS ratings. So when NABERS first launched in 1999, participation was completely voluntary, like it is here in New Zealand. And we saw quite limited uptake to begin with. Really, we were seeing the building owners that were quite progressive when it comes to sustainability and energy efficiency. Around 5 years later, state and federal governments introduced NABERS targets into their procurement policies. And this was for a couple of reasons. Like, first of all, they actually wanted to get a better handle on what their carbon footprint it was in terms of the buildings that they owned and leased. And they also wanted to start to encourage industry to perform better. Those targets applied to government leased and owned office buildings. And this created really strong market signal to industry to rate their buildings and improve performance in order to be considered by government tenants. So you can see kind of the second block in the chart shows the growth and uptake of NABERS ratings once those government procurement policies came into place. And having those policies in place actually then created a critical mass of rated buildings that paved the way for mandatory disclosure. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about mandatory disclosure a little bit later, but I just want to talk a little bit more about the importance of government procurement. So this slide shows very, very different targets that exist across the different states in the Commonwealth of Australia when it comes to procurement of office leases and actually buildings that are owned by government. So the Australian government is actually one of the biggest employers in the country, and that means they also have huge buying power, both in terms of things like offices and also other things like hotels, night stays. State governments also have a big part to play here. So as I said, this slide shows the different procurement targets for owned and leased offices in buildings in Australia. And you can see the text at the top talks about the Commonwealth targets. So the Australian Public Service recently reviewed and updated their procurement guidelines, and they've set a much higher target for new and leased offices. So we've got like a 5.5 star target now for leased offices, and actually 6 stars, which is as high as you can go for new buildings. The other really interesting thing is that they've included other building types, such as hotels, data centres, and warehouses. And in addition to that, we're seeing the incorporation now of embodied carbon standards as well in a variety of state-level policies. Oh, yeah, thank you.
It's a gin and tonic.
Just what I ordered, thank you. And when it comes to the state-level policies, many of those are actually under review as well. So we're expecting to see some more ambitious targets coming soon. And then looks at what's happening in New Zealand. So in 2017, the New Zealand government also introduced NABERS requirements for government-owned and leased buildings under the New Zealand Energy Efficiency and Conservation Strategy. So as in Australia, there are different targets for new builds versus leased buildings. And that requirement to have a rating comes into effect at the end of next year. So I imagine this strategy is actually one of the drivers for the increased uptake in NABERS New Zealand ratings that we're seeing, and I think that's going to continue to grow. So following on from the introduction of government procurement, what we've seen in Australia is an introduction of mandatory disclosure. So in 2011, the Building Energy Efficiency Disclosure Act was introduced in Australia, and this act requires office buildings to disclose their energy efficiency performance through a NABERS rating at point of sale or point of lease for their tenancies. The way that buildings do that is that they have to include that NABERS rating in their advertising material when they're selling or leasing the building. Initially, that mandatory disclosure applied to buildings greater than 2,000 square metres, and then that threshold was dropped to about 1,000 square metres around 5 or 6 years later. So coming back to this chart, you can see how participation in NABERS then jumped really significantly when disclosure was first introduced at that 2,000 square metre threshold, and then again when it was dropped to 1,000 square metres. So what does that mean in terms of impact? What impact has disclosure had in terms of building performance? So we've been able to track the trajectory of buildings that have been participating in NABERS over the years. So you can see we have the first line, which is the black line, and that shows the early participants that I talked about that were generally already quite motivated by sustainability. You can see they've got a really great trajectory over time where that emissions intensity and energy intensity is decreased over time. Then we see in 2011, when disclosure was first introduced, we had a new cohort of buildings that came on board. I think the really interesting part is the big gap between those buildings that had already been regularly rating with NABERS versus those that were just starting on that journey. We estimate it's about 25 to 30% difference in terms of energy intensity. But the good news is that that cohort then also went on that same trajectory down towards much more efficient operation. And then finally we have the pink line, which is those smaller office buildings that came in a few years later. And again, they were sitting about 25 to 30% above buildings that were already regularly rating and disclosing their performance. I've just got a little blue box over the COVID years. You know, there were some strange things going on with occupancy levels there, which meant that some of the NABERS energy ratings had a few little unusual bumps in them. But I think what we can say now is that those lines have now kind of flattened out again to where we'd expect them to be. So based on the success of that building disclosure program in Australia for offices, the Australian government has actually recently launched a consultation process around expansion of mandatory disclosure to additional building types and potentially even eventual introduction of minimum energy performance standards. So this is quite a busy slide, but basically it shows that proposed roadmap for expansion. There are 4 different groups of building types, and that's based on how long they've been rating with NABERS and that kind of maturity when it comes to energy efficiency. So the buildings that have had NABERS ratings in place for more than 5 years, they're recommended to transition to mandatory disclosure more quickly than those that are still getting to grips with that kind of energy efficiency measurement. The roadmap also suggests a staged approach where larger buildings are required to disclose their performance first. So that's all about impact, getting that done first. So the consultation to the roadmap is open now. And yeah, we're really interested to see what the outcome is in terms of industry feedback on that. So moving swiftly on, I'm going to talk a little bit now about NABERS expansion. So for the last 5 years, NABERS has had a strategic goal to be able to rate all major building types, as well as doubling the number of ratings. NABERS ratings for a variety of different buildings are also baked into decarbonisation roadmaps and many other policies and initiatives. And what that has done is it's meant that we've had a really strategic focus on expansion to as many different building types as possible. So this is kind of like our family tree diagram, you might say. So as you can see, we started with the offices tool in 1999 and then progressively expanded that to hotels, shopping centres, data centres and public hospitals. Traditionally, it could take 2 years or more to actually develop and launch a new rating. So with that strategic focus on expansion and also like significant support and funding from the Australian government, we've been able to fast-track expansion to 6 new sectors in the past 5 years. When we think about sector expansion, the first thing that we do is actually work out the best priority. What's the next sector that we should go to first? And that involves, first of all, understanding the market readiness, like how willing is this sector to pay for a NABERS rating? Do they see the benefit? Are they crying out for it? We also look at the environmental impact as well as the technical feasibility of the tool. And that helps us to make sure that what we're creating is valued by industry and is going to actually have an impact. Just in the last year, we've been very busy. We have just launched a rating tool for schools. We are also expanding to retail stores later this month. And by retail stores, I mean the tenancies within shopping centres, as well as what we call, big box retail. So that's things like IKEA, your homeware stores, and also all the standalone retail stores. So that's kind of covering a lot of that gap around retail. And then the final thing that we're introducing is the NABERS Energy Performance Indicator. So what is the NABERS Energy Performance Indicator? It's actually a new type of product that's designed to quickly cover many building types that would not otherwise be able to participate in NABERS. As I've mentioned, new tool development, even when we're really focused on it, can still take about a year per sector. And so some of these building types would have to wait for a really long time before a NABERS energy rating is available for them. So rather than getting a full NABERS star rating, buildings will receive a verified measure of their energy and emissions intensity. And where we have enough data, a comparison, so that's what that dial is all about. It kind of says how well is your building operating compared to the market average. The tool will initially cover about 30 different subsectors. Some of those include things like swimming pools, museums, food and beverage, sports centres, laboratories, caravan parks, a whole range. So this tool is actually launching next month as well. And we're really interested to see how that goes with industry, given that it's slightly different to the traditional NABERS star rating. Finally, I'm just going to talk a couple of minutes about how private capital is really critical to driving the net zero transition and the ways that sustainability ratings can help to unlock that sustainable finance. So both Australia and New Zealand have a net zero by 2050 target, and buildings have a big part to play in achieving those targets right now. I think we've already heard a lot about that. Thank you, Andrew, for all of those charts that you put up earlier. We already have all the technology available for buildings to reach net zero now, and those technologies are generally already being applied to new buildings. Mostly they're being built with energy efficiency in mind. They're being set up to run 100% on renewable energy, and that embodied carbon conversation is really live right now, particularly for new buildings. However, we do also have a really big challenge when it comes to the thousands of buildings that already exist. Some energy efficiency improvements can be achieved with minimal cost through things like tuning and good maintenance, but other improvements will need capital, particularly when we're thinking about moving buildings away from on-site fossil fuel use. There are many challenges there. You know, there are technical challenges, there's a kind of a lack of capacity in the market and understanding, and there's also the financial challenge, like these things cost money, and that's where sustainable finance comes in. We need to channel private capital towards these building upgrades for existing buildings to get the rate of improvement that we need to reach those net zero targets. So based on that kind of urgency for the need for action, a couple of years ago in NABERS, we did some really deep research to understand how sustainable finance could help fund our transition to net zero. So we talked with banks, assurers, asset owners, other financial institutions to really understand the barriers and opportunities in the sustainable finance field. So the first thing that we heard was, you know, there are a lot of standards out there and a lack of transparency for green loans. So this made it actually really hard to differentiate between all the different offerings out there and make sure they were really green enough. The next thing we heard is there's a lot of standards out there. They each have different boundaries, different requirements. And again, that's very hard to navigate your way through. And it's actually also really hard for sustainability teams to have that language to talk to their treasury teams and navigate through those transactions, particularly for those smaller organizations that maybe don't have a big sustainability team and a big treasury team. And the final thing that we heard was because of, I guess, you know, some of these concerns around making sure that we're complying with the right standards and all those different standards out there, it makes actually complying with sustainable finance and accessing it really complex and time-consuming. So NABERS is really well placed to help address these issues. So first of all, as we've talked about, NABERS ratings, they're third-party verified, they're audited, they're based on actual operational data, and they provide that real level of rigor that financial institutions need to be able to be comfortable that there's a credible measurement of the environmental performance of those buildings. The other thing is NABERS has a really large data set, and that allows us to easily identify top-performing buildings and verify genuine environmental upgrades. I think the other thing is that NABERS ratings are also really well understood by both sustainability teams and financial experts these days. As I talked about, we're doing a lot of sector expansion at the moment. So as we expand to more and more building types, those NABERS ratings can unlock sustainable finance and actually a whole host of other things for more and more sectors. And then the final thing is, NABERS ratings are designed to be easy to use, low cost, and that helps to overcome some of those barriers when it comes to things like complexity of assurance and the cost involved with that. So based on that research, we've developed what we call the NABERS Sustainable Finance Criteria. And what that does is it sets transparent and consistent NABERS-based targets to help asset owners and investors understand which assets could be eligible for green finance. The criteria has been developed based on deep consultation with asset owners, lenders, and sustainable finance assurers. There are two methods in the standard or the criteria. Firstly, method 1 uses NABERS data to set targets for good performance in building energy efficiency upgrades. So essentially those targets ensure that the upgrades, first of all, achieve a 30% emissions reduction, and then also that the buildings are actually improving to at least above market average. The second method is using NABERS ratings to identify low-carbon buildings and portfolios that are in the top 15% of their cohort. And this is based on those big data sets that we have. GBCA and NZGBC have also released sustainable finance guides that provide that similar guidance on what green looks like from a sustainable finance perspective, using Green Star, NABERS, and actually other rating tools as well. So shout out to Jorge, wherever you are. I know you put a lot of work into the GBCA guide, up the back, and also to you, Bobby, for the New Zealand guide. And I think the great thing is that we're hearing that banks and other financial institutions are actually using these guides to develop their own frameworks for sustainable finance, which is exactly what we want them to do, to take away that uncertainty and give a really consistent message to industry about what good looks like. There's a real appetite for investments with those strong sustainability credentials, and this kind of investment is going to be key to driving the transition to net zero. So that's everything I was going to talk to you about today. I think we might have a couple of minutes for questions, but I'm also going to be around for the rest of the day. I've already had some great conversations with some of you over the last couple of days.
Great. Thank you, Magali. And I've seen some really great questions come through on the Q&A function of the app. Thanks so much for your presentation, Magali. There are a few here. The first, which is probably most pertinent to all of us, is when will New Zealand introduce mandatory NABERS ratings? That's a big question.
That is a big question. It's actually not one I can answer either. So I think that's probably a better question for some of our government colleagues in the room. But we know that there is definitely market interest and there's benefits from that transparency that comes from mandatory disclosure.
Yeah, and we've been linking in NABERS Australia to those government departments to understand the value prospect of NABERS here and doing a lot of advocacy in this space. The second one is, why do you think New Zealand lagged behind Australia in NABERS usage?
I think there's a few reasons for that. I mean, firstly, the NABERS New Zealand rating was introduced quite a lot later than NABERS in Australia, so you're starting later. And then I think, there's still some work to do in terms of policy signals to gain that critical mass in terms of office ratings. But I think we're starting to see that now, Bobby.
And why do you think, the next one, it's just jumped around. Is it possible to get a NABERS rating for an office component of an industrial development? And if not, why? I know you guys have an industrial tool, so maybe you want to talk a bit about that.
That's quite a complicated question. I mean, I think the question is, it depends. The answer, it depends on the size of the office within the warehouse, and it depends on whether you have sub-metering for that office component as well. So I know that's something that's quite a hot topic in Australia at the moment. So yeah, in some circumstances, it is possible to actually rate the office component of your warehouse using a NABERS office rating, but I think it depends on the size and the metering arrangements.
And I understand that the warehouse component of that warehouse tool, it includes the office component if it is a support function of the logistics.
Or so, if it's smaller than a certain size as well.
That's right.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Magali. Let's all give her a round of applause.